It started with 2 cell phones in a garden, and at the time, nobody had any reason to think that small detail mattered at all. Early in the morning on the 2nd of November, 2007, a man who lived on a hillside in Perugia, Italy, stepped into his yard and noticed 2 phones lying in the weeds. Not broken, not hidden, just sitting there like they'd been dropped in a hurry. So he picked them up and did what most people would do. He brought them to the police, specifically the postal police, the unit that handles lost phones, online scams, and tech-related cases. And when the officers turned the phones on and checked the records, both of them traced back to the same address, a small villa partway up the slope above the city. So instead of filing paperwork and moving on, they decided to drive up and return the phones in person, which is how they ended up pulling up to that villa a short time later and seeing 2 people standing outside the gate, both of them looking tense and restless. One was a 20-year-old American student named Amanda, and the other was her Italian boyfriend, Raffaele, who was 23. And before the officers even explained why they were there, Amanda started talking. She told them she lived upstairs in the apartment, that she had come back that morning to grab clean clothes and take a shower, and that when she arrived, the front door was already open. But she said she didn't think much of it because the lock on that old door was unreliable and sometimes looked shut when it wasn't. So she went inside, walked straight to the bathroom, and that's when she noticed a few small spots of dried blood on the faucet. Then she looked down and saw a stain on the bath mat, and she said her heart jumped for a second, but only for a second, because she immediately talked herself out of it. Maybe someone had cut themselves shaving, maybe someone had a nosebleed, maybe it was nothing. So she took a shower anyway, and later this would become one of the most talked about moments in the entire case. Why she didn't leave, why she didn't call the police, why she stayed. But at the time, she said, it didn't feel like a crime scene. It felt like a messy bathroom. And after she finished, she remembered the hairdryer was in the other bathroom down the hall. So she walked over and pushed that door open, and this time she froze, because the toilet hadn't been flushed, and there was waste still in the bowl, which by itself might not sound dramatic. But in that apartment, it was wrong. 4 women lived there, and all of them were careful about keeping things clean. This wasn't normal, and that was when the pieces stopped looking harmless. An open front door, blood in the sink, a toilet that hadn't been flushed, and she said that was when it finally crossed her mind that maybe someone had been in the apartment who didn't live there. Maybe someone was still there. So she grabbed her bag, left the apartment, and ran downhill to Raffaele's place. And that was where her story paused, at least for the moment, because 4 days later, both of them would be arrested for murder. But standing there outside the villa with the postal police, none of that had happened yet. The officers explained why they were there, that a neighbor had found 2 phones in his garden, and both traced back to this address. And as soon as they said that, Amanda recognized them. They weren't just any phones, they belonged to her roommate Meredith, who had 2 phones, one with a UK number and one with an Italian number, registered under another roommate's name, and these were hers. And that changed the tone immediately. Amanda told the officers that Meredith wasn't answering her calls, that her bedroom door was locked from the inside, and that something felt very wrong. But the postal police couldn't break down doors, and they weren't homicide detectives. So Raffaele called the regular police and reported a possible break-in. And while they waited, the other roommates started arriving. One of them went into her bedroom and saw that the window was shattered. Glass everywhere, clothes thrown across the floor, drawers pulled out. It looked like a burglary, except the laptop was still there, the camera was still there, jewelry was still there, and that didn't make sense. And everyone kept looking at Meredith's door, still locked, and they told the officers again that this wasn't normal for her, that she never locked her door like that they were scared, but nobody moved. And finally, one of the friends lost patience, walked up, took a step back, and kicked the door in, and the smell hit first, then the screaming started. Meredith was on the floor, covered by a blanket, blood on the walls, on the furniture, on the floor. Her body left where she fell, and she was already gone. And that was the moment when the story changed from a strange morning to a crime that would follow these people for the next 8 years. And it didn't take long for attention to land on Amanda. She was the one who found the blood, the one who took a shower, the one who left and came back, the one dating someone who lived close by, and to police, and soon to the media. Her behavior didn't look like panic. It looked strange. But before any of that mattered, before the headlines, before the courtrooms, before the trials that would stretch across countries, there was a simpler question that nobody outside that hillside could answer yet. Why was a college student from Seattle living in a centuries-old villa in central Italy, sharing an apartment with 3 women she had only just met? And how did a year abroad turn into a crime scene that would divide the world? Because to understand how Amanda ended up standing outside that gate, while police returned 2 phones to her front door, you have to go back to where her story actually began. Amanda Knox didn't come to Italy because she was running from anything. She came because she wanted more life than what her routine back home was giving her. She grew up in Seattle, born in 1987, in what most people would call a stable, middle-class family. Her mother was a school teacher, her father worked in business, and when she was still very young, her parents divorced. But they stayed close, literally. They bought houses only a few streets apart, so their daughters could move easily between them. And in front of the kids, there were no shouting matches, no public blame, just 2 adults trying to keep things normal. And Amanda grew up in that space, comfortable, encouraged, but also restless. She wasn't interested in the kind of future people usually plan for. Law school, corporate jobs, steady careers. She liked words, languages, stories. She talked about wanting to be a writer long before she knew what that really meant. In high school, she joined the soccer team, not because she loved the sport, but because she liked the energy of it. The running, the contact, the way you had to react without thinking too much. Her teammates gave her a nickname, Foxy Knoxy, because she moved fast and slipped through defenders. At the time, it was just a joke, something that stuck, and nobody thought much about it. Not until years later, when reporters would drag it out and turn it into something darker. But back then, she was just another teenager trying on different versions of herself. After graduation, she went to the University of Washington and studied linguistics, and she did well. Good grades, dean's list, the kind of student teachers expect to keep going. But halfway through college, she started feeling boxed in. Class, homework, campus, repeat, and it didn't feel like the kind of life that would give her anything real to write about. She wanted to be somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere where she'd have to figure things out as she went. And Italy had been in her head for years. When she was 14, her family took a trip there, and something about it stayed with her. The streets, the pace, the way people talked with their hands and took their time. So in 2007, she decided she would study abroad for a year. Her mother supported it almost immediately. Her father hesitated, worried about money and safety and whether she'd manage the language. But in the end, he agreed, and Amanda spent that summer working 3 jobs to save up, waiting tables, tutoring, doing whatever she could, until she had about $10,000 set aside. And when she finally booked the flight, she made one decision that would end up mattering more than she could have known. She didn't want to live in a dorm. She wanted to live with locals. She thought that was how you really learn a place. So in September of 2007, she flew to a small city most people outside Italy have never heard of, Perugia, tucked into the hills between Florence and Rome, quiet, old, and home to a university that attracts students from all over the world, especially people studying Italian. When she arrived, she stayed in a hotel for a few days and started looking for housing, checking bulletin boards and listings at the school, and then she saw an ad for a room in a villa on a hillside. She went to see it, and almost immediately said yes. The house was more than 300 years old, split into 2 separate apartments, one upstairs and one downstairs, each with its own entrance. Amanda and 3 other women lived on the upper floor, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, shared kitchen. The rent was about €1,200 total, split 4 ways. And on September 20, she moved in. The roommates were a mix. 2 Italian women who had been living there for years, Laura and Filomena, both in their late 20s and working in legal jobs. And the 4th was Meredith, a 21-year-old student from London, also in Italy on exchange. Like Amanda, her parents were divorced. She was on her own in a foreign country, and their rooms were next to each other. So they naturally spent a lot of time together at first, walking back from class, cooking simple dinners, trying to make sense of menus and bus schedules. Downstairs lived 4 Italian guys in their 20s, and they liked to have people over. Music, drinks, sometimes marijuana, and in that social circle, Amanda and Meredith met friends of friends, people who would show up, hang out, then disappear again. One of those people was a guy named Rudy, who didn't live in the house but came by often enough that everyone recognized him. Nobody thought much of it. It was just part of the student scene. And for Amanda, the days felt almost too empty. Her classes only ran from 9 to 11 in the morning. After that, she had nothing scheduled, which sounded nice until she realized how long the afternoons were. So she asked Laura if she knew of any part-time work, and that's how she met Patrick, the owner of a small bar near campus. He liked her energy. She liked that she spoke some Italian and wasn't shy, and he hired her to help bring in customers and work nights. Sometimes she'd hand out flyers during the day, then start her shift around 9 at night and work until 1 or 2 in the morning, and then, about a week before everything fell apart, she met Raffaele. They met at a classical music concert, talked, exchanged numbers, and from that night on, they were almost always together, studying, cooking, watching movies, and within days, she was spending most nights at his apartment a few hundred meters away. And then Halloween came, the city filled with students in costumes. Meredith dressed up, took photos, and nobody knew that would be the last picture ever taken of her. The next day was All Saints' Day, a public holiday, shops closed, streets quieter than usual. Amanda was supposed to work that night, but around 8:30 Patrick texted her that the bar was slow and she didn't need to come in. She replied in Italian, something like, "Okay, see you later. Have a good night." And according to her, she stayed at Raffaele's apartment. They watched a movie, cooked, went to sleep. Nothing out of the ordinary. No fights, no visitors, just another quiet night. And when she woke up the next morning, she had no reason to think that anything had happened at her place on the hill, that her roommate was already dead, and that by the end of the day, her life would start bending in a direction she would never be able to straighten out again. By the time the forensic team finished their first examination of Meredith's body, the apartment no longer felt like a shared student place. It felt sealed off from normal life, and the details they recorded that afternoon would shape everything that came next. They estimated her time of death to be sometime between late evening on November 1 and the early hours of November 2. They noted dozens of wounds across her body, including deep cuts to her neck, and many smaller injuries on her hands and arms that suggested she had tried to fight back, and they documented signs of sexual assault. None of this was announced to the people standing outside, but word traveled fast, and by that evening, reporters were already gathering near the villa. While inside, investigators began working through the rooms, starting with the bedroom that looked like it had been burglarized, the shattered window, the stone on the floor, clothes scattered everywhere, and at first glance, it seemed obvious. Someone had broken in, searched the place, and things had gone wrong. But as they looked closer, small details started to feel off. The window was more than 3 meters above the ground, not an easy climb, especially at night, and there were no broken glass fragments on the ground outside, which you would expect if a rock had been thrown in from the street. Instead, almost all the glass was inside the room, and more than that, the glass sat on top of the scattered clothes, not underneath them, which suggested the room had been disturbed first, and the window broken afterward, like someone wanted it to look like a break-in. And then there was the missing part. Nothing valuable had actually been taken. The laptop was still there, the camera was still there, cash and jewelry were untouched, and when you add that to the locked bedroom door where Meredith had been found, the scene stopped looking random and started looking staged. And that shift in interpretation happened quickly, because within hours, police began focusing less on an unknown intruder and more on the people who had been closest to Meredith, which meant the roommates, and especially Amanda, because she had been the first to notice something wrong, and because of what she did after she noticed it. She had taken a shower, she had left, she had come back, and from the outside, that sequence didn't sit well with investigators. Later that day, Amanda and Raffaele were taken to the police station for questioning, not as suspects, at least not officially, but as witnesses. They were asked to walk through the morning, step by step, what time they woke up, when they left his apartment, what she saw when she arrived, what she touched, where she went, and Amanda tried to be precise, but some of her answers changed slightly as she remembered more details, and every time something shifted, officers wrote it down, and outside the station, journalists were already forming opinions. Cameras zoomed in when she hugged Raffaele, when she leaned into him, when he kissed her forehead, and those images would be replayed again and again, sometimes without context, sometimes slowed down, and soon, people weren't just talking about what had happened in the apartment. They were talking about how Amanda was acting, why she wasn't crying more, why she seemed calm, why she looked affectionate, and within days, the story in the media started turning, from tragic crime to strange behavior by an American girl, and the questions kept coming. Why didn't she call the police when she saw blood? Why did she take a shower? Why did she go back to her boyfriend instead of checking on her roommate? And Amanda said the same thing each time, that she didn't think it was serious, that she assumed it was a small accident, that she didn't imagine something violent had happened. And that explanation might have sounded reasonable to some people, but to investigators who were now looking at a murder scene, it felt thin. And over the next few days, Amanda and Raffaele were brought in again and again, long interviews, sometimes late into the night. And at first, they both said the same thing, that they had been together at his apartment all night on November 1, that they watched a movie, cooked, and went to sleep. And Amanda showed them the text message from her boss saying she didn't need to come to work, and her reply wishing him a good evening. But the police didn't see that message the same way. They argued that it sounded like she was saying she would see him later, not that she was staying home. And when she tried to explain that it was just a common phrase, something like saying, "see you," they weren't convinced. And then there was something else that started to matter more than it probably should have. Amanda admitted that she and some of the people in the house had occasionally smoked marijuana, including on nights when friends were over. She hadn't mentioned it in earlier interviews because she didn't know how serious that could be in Italy, and she didn't want trouble. But once she said it, officers treated it like another crack in her story, another thing she hadn't been honest about from the start, and the tone of the questioning shifted. It became less about gathering information and more about pressing for contradictions. And then, late on the night of November 5, after hours of questioning, something broke. An officer told Amanda that Raffaele had already told them she left his apartment that night, that she had gone out, and that he had placed her elsewhere. And whether that was true or not, in that moment, she believed it. And after being awake and questioned for hours, in a language she wasn't fluent in, she started doubting her own memory. She said later that images began to surface in her mind, not clear memories, more like flashes. And when officers suggested a name, Patrick, her boss, she said she could picture him there. She said she didn't know if it was real or if she was imagining it. But in the middle of that night, that uncertainty turned into a statement. And once it was written down, it stopped being uncertainty and started being evidence. And within hours, Patrick was arrested at his home, and Amanda and Raffaele were no longer witnesses. They were suspects. And by the time the sun came up over Perugia, 3 people were in custody. And the idea that Meredith's death involved more than one person was no longer just a theory. It was the official direction of the investigation. And from that point on, the case would stop being about what happened in one locked bedroom and start becoming something much bigger, louder, and far harder to control. Patrick's arrest didn't last long, because almost immediately, the story he told didn't match the one the police were building. His bar had been open that night, even if business was slow, and there were employees and customers who said he was there for hours. Not leaving, not disappearing, just working, and phone records supported that. So within 2 weeks, the case against him collapsed, and he was released without charges. But by then, the damage was done. His name had already been linked to a murder in headlines. His business was in trouble, and the fact that Amanda had named him under questioning didn't fade. It just changed meaning, because once Patrick was cleared, the narrative shifted to something darker, that she had tried to point the finger at an innocent man to save herself. And that idea stuck. At the same time, investigators were getting results from the forensic work inside Meredith's bedroom. Blood samples, fingerprints, DNA, and what they found there didn't point to Amanda or Raffaele at all. It pointed to someone else, a man named Rudy Guede, the same guy who used to show up at the villa to hang out with the guys downstairs. His DNA was on Meredith's body, on her belongings, and even in the bathroom. And that wasn't a small trace. It was everywhere. And when police ran his name, they found he already had a record for burglary and theft, including a recent break-in at an office not far from the villa. And by the time they realized how central he might be to the case, he was gone. He had left Italy and crossed into Germany. And when he was arrested there on November 20, the timing felt strange, because it was the same day Patrick was released. And now, finally, police had someone whose physical presence at the scene couldn't be argued away. And when Rudy was questioned, he admitted he had been there that night. But he said he wasn't the killer. He claimed Meredith had invited him over, that they had consensual sex, and that he went to the bathroom. Afterward, with his headphones on, and while he was in there, he heard a scream, ran out, and saw a man with a knife, someone he said he didn't recognize, who attacked him and then fled. And Rudy said he found Meredith bleeding, tried to help, panicked, and ran. And he admitted that leaving was wrong, but he insisted he wasn't the one who killed her. And if you stop there, it almost sounds like the case should have split in two, one path leading straight to Rudy, and the other letting Amanda and Raffaele go. But that's not what happened, because at the same time Rudy's DNA was being linked to the scene, forensic analysts were looking at Meredith's injuries, and they reached a conclusion that would keep Amanda and Raffaele in the frame. The pattern of wounds suggested more than one attacker, not just multiple cuts, but cuts from different angles, different depths, and defensive injuries that suggested she had been restrained and attacked in more than one way. And Meredith wasn't physically helpless. She had trained in martial arts and boxing, so the idea that one person could control her, assault her, and inflict that many injuries without help seemed unlikely to the experts reviewing the case. And that led prosecutors to a theory they would hold on to for years, that Rudy had not acted alone, that he was part of a group, and that Amanda and Raffaele were with him. And this was where the story took a turn that shocked a lot of people. because the prosecution didn't argue that this was a robbery gone wrong or a sudden argument. They argued that it was the result of a sexual encounter that spiraled out of control, that the three of them were involved in some kind of group situation, that Meredith refused to participate, and that things turned violent. And that theory didn't come from any confession or any direct witness. It came from how the injuries looked, from assumptions about the relationships between the people involved, and from the fact that Amanda and Raffaele admitted to using marijuana, which prosecutors argued could lower inhibitions and lead to reckless behavior. And once that idea was introduced, it became the lens through which everything else was interpreted. Raffaele owned knives. He liked certain movies and comics that included violent themes. Amanda had a reputation among some classmates for being impulsive, and those ordinary details were now treated like warning signs. And while all of this was unfolding, the media was building its own version of Amanda, digging up old photos, party pictures, snapshots of her smiling with friends, and those images were used to paint her as carefree, even reckless, and her old soccer nickname, Foxy Knoxy, was pulled out and twisted into something sinister, as if it had always meant something dangerous instead of just a joke from teammates. And the more that image spread, the easier it became for people to accept the idea that she could be capable of something extreme, even though no physical evidence put her in Meredith's bedroom at the time of the attack. And Rudy's case moved faster than the others. He chose a fast-track trial, which in Italy can reduce a sentence in exchange for a simplified process. And in 2008, he was convicted and sentenced to prison, though he continued to say others were involved, sometimes hinting at Amanda and Raffaele, sometimes suggesting a stranger, and prosecutors took those statements as further support for the multiple attacker theory, while Amanda and Raffaele waited in jail, now officially charged with murder. And from the outside, the case looked settled to many people. There was a victim, there was DNA, there were confessions that had been partially retracted, and there was a dramatic story that seemed to explain everything. But inside the legal process, cracks were already forming because the pieces didn't fit together as cleanly as they looked on television. And those cracks were about to become the center of a trial that would turn into one of the most closely watched courtroom battles in modern Italian history. When the trial of Amanda and Raffaele finally began in January 2009, it felt less like the start of an investigation and more like the continuation of a story people thought they already understood. Prosecutors opened by laying out the same theory they had been repeating for months, that this was not a lone attack, that it was a group situation that escalated, and that Amanda and Raffaele were not just present but active participants. And to make that idea easier to visualize, they even presented a reconstructed sequence of events, showing how the three defendants supposedly moved through the apartment, who held Meredith, who used a knife, who cleaned up afterward, and none of that was based on a witness who had seen it happen. It was based on how they believed the injuries must have occurred, and on what they believed the relationships between the people must have been. And from the very beginning, the defense focused on one simple problem. There was no reliable physical evidence that placed either Amanda or Raffaele in Meredith's bedroom at the time of the killing. No blood, no fingerprints, no DNA that could be clearly tied to them, and yet, the prosecution kept pointing to three pieces of evidence they said proved involvement. The first was a kitchen knife taken from Raffaele's apartment, which investigators said had Meredith's DNA on the blade and Amanda's DNA on the handle, making it, in their view, the murder weapon. The second was a metal clasp from Meredith's bra found on the floor of her room, which they said carried Raffaele's DNA. And the third was a series of glowing footprints detected with a chemical spray in the bathroom and hallway, which they claimed were Amanda's, left behind after stepping in Meredith's blood and then walking through the apartment. And to people watching from the outside, that sounded convincing. A knife, a piece of clothing, and bloody footprints. But, in court, those details began to look less solid. The defense pointed out that the knife was much larger than the wounds on Meredith's neck, that no visible blood was found on it, and that the DNA detected on the blade was so small it was below standard thresholds for reliable testing, meaning it could have been contamination from the lab or from handling during collection. And when it came to the bra clasp, the defense noted that it had not been collected until weeks after the murder, during which time the crime scene had been entered repeatedly by police and technicians, often without protective covers on their shoes, and that the clasp itself carried multiple mixed DNA profiles, not just Raffaele's, making it impossible to say when or how his genetic material got there. And as for the glowing footprints, independent experts explained that the chemical used reacts not only to blood, but also to cleaning products and other substances, and no follow-up tests were done to confirm that what was glowing was actually blood at all. But despite those challenges, the prosecution continued to return to the idea of behavior, how Amanda acted at the crime scene, how she acted afterward, how she behaved in custody. They showed footage of her kissing Raffaele outside the apartment, hugging him, leaning into him, and they asked the court to consider whether that looked like grief, and they brought up her changing statements, her confusion during interrogation, and the fact that she had mentioned Patrick's name that night, even though he was later cleared. And to them, this wasn't just a mistake, it was an attempt to mislead, and throughout the trial, Amanda became more than a defendant. She became a character. Her clothes were discussed, her facial expressions, her tone of voice, even a t-shirt she once wore to court with a printed slogan about love was framed as manipulative, as if she were trying to send a message to the jury. And no matter what she did, it seemed to be interpreted in the worst possible way. If she looked calm, it was because she was cold. If she cried, it was because she was acting. If she stayed quiet, it was because she was hiding something. And in that environment, the defense struggled to keep the focus on the actual evidence. Because while they could explain why the knife was unreliable, why the bra clasp was compromised, and why the footprints were unconfirmed, those explanations were technical, slow, and not nearly as gripping as the story the prosecution was telling. A story of jealousy, drugs, and violence. And even though Rudy had already been convicted, and even though his DNA was all over the room, prosecutors argued that this didn't exclude Amanda and Raffaele. It simply proved he was one of several people involved. And when Rudy spoke about the case from prison, sometimes hinting that others were there, sometimes not, those shifting statements were still used to support the idea of multiple attackers, not to question it. And as the months passed, the trial became less about what could be proven and more about which version of events felt more believable, the messy reality of a chaotic crime scene, or the cleaner narrative of a group crime that explained every injury and every strange behavior. And by the time closing arguments arrived, it was clear that the court was not just deciding whether two young people had committed murder, it was deciding whether the story built around them had become too strong to dismantle. And when the verdict was finally read in December 2009, after nearly a year of testimony and media pressure, the decision landed hard. Amanda was found guilty and sentenced to 26 years in prison. Raffaele was found guilty and sentenced to 25. And in that moment, whatever doubts still existed outside the courtroom didn't matter, because on paper, the case was closed. Two more people had been convicted, and Meredith's death was officially the result of a crime committed by three, not one, and as guards led Amanda and Raffaele back into custody, there was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, just the quiet understanding that the story was not over, because in Italy, a conviction does not end a case, it only moves it to the next stage, and both of them were about to appeal. The appeal began quietly, without crowds or cameras, and for the first time the conversation shifted away from how anyone looked or acted, and back to how the evidence had actually been collected, because the defense wasn't offering a new version of that night. They were asking whether the old version could really stand up, and independent forensic experts were brought in to review the key items, not the same teams who had handled them before. And they started with the knife taken from Raffaele's kitchen, noting that the blade did not match the size or shape of the main neck wounds, that there was no visible blood on it, and that the tiny trace of DNA said to belong to Meredith was below accepted scientific thresholds, too small to be reliable. Then they moved to the bra clasp, which had been left on the bedroom floor for weeks before being collected, during a time when the room had been entered again and again by people without protective covers, and they showed how it had been moved, handled, and stepped near, and that it carried mixed DNA from several sources, making it impossible to say when or how any one person's genetic material had gotten there. And finally, they addressed the glowing marks in the hallway and bathroom, explaining that the chemical used reacts to many substances besides blood, and that no follow-up testing had been done. So there was no scientific basis to say those marks were blood at all, and as those findings were presented, the case that once looked heavy with physical proof started to thin out. But the appeal was also about what happened in the interrogation room, because Amanda's overnight statements were still part of the record, even though she had pulled them back almost immediately, and the defense described the conditions of that night. Hours of questioning, no lawyer present, no qualified interpreter, repeated claims that police already knew what had happened, and pressure to imagine scenes she could not confirm. And when judges reviewed how those statements were obtained, they ruled they could not be treated as voluntary confessions and should never have been used to build the case. And with that, one of the main supports of the original theory dropped away, because without those statements, there was no direct claim placing Amanda in the bedroom during the attack. And in October 2011, the court overturned the convictions and ordered Amanda and Raffaele released. And when they walked out of prison, there was no celebration, just the sense that this still wasn't finished. And it wasn't, because prosecutors appealed to Italy's highest court, arguing that the review had missed important points. And in 2013, the High Court sent the case back again, reopening everything. And this time, Amanda stayed in the United States while her lawyers argued in Italy. And in 2014, the new appeal court reinstated the guilty verdicts, sentencing her and Raffaele once more, and for a moment it felt like the story had snapped back to its original shape. And Italian authorities issued an international arrest warrant for Amanda, requesting extradition, while American courts reviewed whether the process met international standards. And as that review continued, the case returned one final time to Italy's Supreme Court, not for another full trial, but for a decision on whether the convictions could legally stand. And in March 2015, the court ruled that the evidence was insufficient, that critical forensic findings were unreliable, that investigative mistakes had compromised the case, and that the theory of multiple attackers involving Amanda and Raffaele was not supported by credible facts. And with that ruling, their convictions were permanently annulled, and the court concluded that Meredith had been killed by Rudy Guade, acting alone, legally closing the case. But even then, nothing about that night became clearer, because a legal ending is not the same as an answer. And long after the courtrooms emptied and the cameras moved on, the questions stayed where they had always been, inside that upstairs apartment, in a room where the window was broken after the drawers were already open, where a door was locked from the inside, where a struggle left marks that no timeline ever fully explained. And while the law finally chose one version of events, the scene itself never spoke again. And what remains is not a neat story of guilt or innocence, but the image of a quiet house on a hill, a bedroom door that did not open until it was forced, and a night when something went wrong and no one else was there to see it. And even after every appeal was finished and every sentence was written down, that part never changed, because whatever the courts decided years later, the truth of what happened in that room had already happened, and it was over long before anyone went looking for two phones in a garden.